Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 7th of August and today we're going to be doing a full front update and then we're going to be talking about Crimea. Let's begin by looking at Kupyansk, where there is a minor update to the front lines and I've adjusted the map accordingly. I've also added in a larger gray zone and I've tried to make the front lines as accurate as possible. But generally what we've seen is that the Russians have advanced about 1 kilometer to the south of Vilshana, and that occurred around the 6th of August. And this is generally occurring in the area between Liman Pershi and Vilshana, this new Russian push. And the reason why it's important is because the Russians are trying to basically kick out the Ukrainians from their defensive node in Synkivka. Synkivka has been this vanguard for the Ukrainians, this holdout to the north of Kupyansk, which is preventing the Russians from going further south and beginning to attack Kupyansk and its suburbs. So for a while now, we've seen attacks on Synkivka directly from the north, from Liman Pershi, and then the Russians started attacking the forested areas, and then from there, they used their new positions in the forest to attack Synkivka from the northwest. But regardless, the 14th Mechanized Brigade in this area was able to hold the line, so now the Russians are attacking from the northeast in an effort to perhaps go through this road over here and attack Synkivka itself from the northeast, and then you'll have the town being developed from three different sides. And the Russian goal, of course, is to squeeze out the Ukrainians and then go to the south to Kupyansk. Now, moving to the south to the Zherebets River, we do have to talk about the bridgehead because there have been some changes to the map over there. So both sides have actually gained some land and lost some land. Starting out with the Russian forces, they have been able to counterattack around Novogorivka. I'll just quickly explain the situation around that town. So the Ukrainians, about a week ago, they launched their counterattack against the bridgehead, and they were able to establish positions back in the town of Novogorivka that was previously under Russian control. And then from there, they began attacking the hedgerows that were to the east of Novogorivka. And so the Russians, with the 21st Motor Rifle Brigade, they were able to hold the line for a while. And eventually, they were grouped around Kovalivka and some of the areas that are just to the west of it. And then from there, they were able to counterattack themselves and were able to retake the hedgerows that were previously contested or under Ukrainian control. So this rectangle that you see over here, this is now under Russian control. Before it was not, and now the Russians have reestablished control in that area as they try to push back into Novogorivka itself. So perhaps the Russians have advanced at most 2 kilometers in this direction, and there is some heavy fighting going on the outskirts of Novogorivka as the Russians try to reestablish their fort positions that they previously had when they initially crossed over the Zherebets River and took over the three towns near the bridgehead itself. And in terms of the Ukrainian gains, the Ukrainians have been pushing towards Karmazynivka for really a while now. Even before the Russians launched their own attack across the river, the Ukrainians were still harassing this town and they were shelling it pretty heavily from some of their forward artillery outposts. So it does make sense that the Ukrainians are now putting more of an emphasis on it, and it's also a way to sort of spread out the Russian forces and prevent them from going on the attack themselves. So the Ukrainians, if you look at their vector of attack, it looks something like this. The main Ukrainian push is coming in this area over here. You could see a bulge in the line where there's a pretty large gray zone, and that's an area where the Ukrainians are currently advancing. They're trying to take over positions in the forested areas that were at least previously under Russian control in this bridgehead. And that will give them some good forward positions to then eventually reach the frontline towns that the Russians are using to cross over the river and fight against the Ukrainians. And one of those towns, really the most important town in this entire bridgehead, is Karmazynivka. That's where a lot of the forces are crossing over with bridges. There's pontoon bridges being set up, and that's also a local hub for coordination. Then a bit to the south, you also have some Ukrainian attacks in this direction. The Ukrainians have been able to retake some of the forested areas, and others have turned into a gray zone. So the Russians have been forced to withdraw, you could say, 1 or maybe at most 1.5 kilometers in this section. They do still hold positions in some of the forested areas that are very, very close to the river, and that's really the bare minimum that you could hold on to if you want to have a bridgehead. So what I'm referring to is this area over here. You can see a bit of a Russian bulge, and the Ukrainian goal is to squeeze out the remaining Russian forces from this area in the coming days. But for now, the fighting is really on a smaller scale than it was before. Small infantry groups fighting each other. You have BMPs that are roaming through the open fields, and also clashing with one another. So that's generally the nature of the fighting around this bridgehead. It's turned into more of a positional battle. Now, moving on to the situation around Staromayorsk and Oruzhenie. Around the morning of August 6th, the Ukrainians they began attacking the town of Oruzhenie from two different directions. One of them is already familiar to us. It's from the north. This has been a recurring theme. Ukrainians trying to attack through this road that is at least originates from Blavatne and then goes to the south. And that's a very difficult area to actually make concrete gains in, because what you have is just one road, and then all of the different vehicles they get concentrated in one specific area, and it really does turn into a kill zone. With the Russians, with already having the artillery advantage, it is very difficult to just advance through one specific vector and expect not to be fired upon heavily. And that's why we've seen the Russians successfully repel attacks from the north up until now. But now the Ukrainians have also launched another vector of attack from a different direction. That's from Staromayorsk. And that's what we were talking about when we talked about the Russians leaving Staromayorsk. The implication is that now the Ukrainians have an opportunity to enter that town. Maybe they won't have a full 100% grasp over the entirety of the town, but they can enter it now because there's no Russian forces there. And they can then attempt to cross over the Mokriali River and attack Oruzhenie from the flanks. So that's what happened actually yesterday. So they began attacking across the river, and the Ukrainians they advanced with several tanks, armored vehicles, and around two platoons. And during that assault, which is really the first assault of its nature, the first assault across the Mokriali River, so it is still important to remember that it's still in a nascent stage, and we're going to see more of this. But really, during that first round of attacks, at least one tank actually sank into the Mokriali River. Here's the geolocation for that. I didn't geolocate it myself. You could see the credits in that description. What happened was a Ukrainian T-72, it was being harassed by a drone, I believe, a kamikaze drone, and then it lost control and actually fell into the river. It sank. In the video, I don't know if the entire crew survived, but you could see that at least one or two people were able to escape and begin swimming towards the coast. And so the crew itself probably isn't damaged, but you could see that there was damage to obviously that one tank. And then other tanks were damaged because of artillery strikes by the Russians and by drones such as Lancets and FPVs. So that first attack by the Ukrainians was around 5 a.m. of yesterday. And then after the initial attack, there was a pause of about an hour and a half before the second wave was launched. And that second wave was also generally repelled. There's not much of a frontline update to talk about because Oruzhenie is still under full Russian control. Ukrainian sources don't dispute that it's under Russian control, but they did talk about the progress made by the Ukrainians around Staromayorsk. And that's true. You could say that now the Ukrainians have a better grasp over this town, a better grip over the town than they did previously. And so, at least in that regard, there is movement, but the Russians do still hold the line around Oruzhenie, and this is also confirmed by Russian sources on the ground. They're saying that they're not going to retreat. They're going to try to hold on to the flanks, despite the very difficult situation for the Russians in this area. Because look at it, it's going to be very difficult for Russia to supply their garrison in this area. There's only one road really leading through it, and the bulge in this area around Oruzhenie that the Russians control is very narrow and is susceptible to being cut off. It's only about 2.3 kilometers. And really the thing that's helping the Russians the most is the fact that they do have the artillery advantage and the fact that they are using drones to try to stop the advancing Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are trying to jam the Russian communications in this area in order to make their defensive coordination much more weak. And so that's something that you also have to look out for in the future. Now, let's move on to the situation around Robotyne. Now, on the Robotyne sector, there's not much fighting going on right now in comparison to the heavy fighting that occurred over a week ago now. But what did happen is that the Russians, they began sending in these smaller groups, these small infantry groups, not really aided as much by armored vehicles, but they are trying to retake some of the forward positions that were either taken by the Ukrainians or are now in the gray zone. So the Russians have been advancing through some of these areas that are marking with these rectangles. This is generally where the Russian activity is concentrated. And the Russians are aiming to advance in this area just to the east of Robotyne, taking over bush lines, taking over trenches that are now vacant in an effort to fortify their positions again. Because all these trenches in this area, all these bush lines, those were originally Russian fortifications. It's a part of Russia's first line of defense around Robotyne. not the main defensive line around Zaporizhia, but the specific defense line around Robotyne. And part of those defenses have been taken over by the Ukrainians. I'll actually show them to you. These defenses over here are under Ukrainian control. There's a forested area over there. There's a trench system that was taken over by the Ukrainians. But then there's additional lines a bit to the south, and those are contested at the moment. Neither side has control over them. There's also a forested area that's contested over, and that also provides some good, it's a good hill in that area. So it's a good local high ground to have control over that overlooks the local fields where a lot of the fighting has been ongoing. And so the Russians are steadily trying to reoccupy these positions in lieu of another Ukrainian attempt at launching attacks. It would be better for the Russians to establish a buffer zone on the eastern flank of Robotyne to look something like this in order to really grind down the Ukrainians at the line of contact rather than more towards the rear where Russians are still trying to build up even more defenses to prevent a wider Ukrainian breakthrough. But that's it. That's all I have for the front line. Let's now talk about the Ukrainian strikes on the bridges that go over from Crimea into Kherson. This is extremely important because really some of Russia's main logistical routes, they go through Crimea. There is, of course, the understanding that the Russians can use the land bridge from Russia proper through Donetsk and Luhansk and Zaporizhia to reach the front line. But that would take longer, and if those were the only routes that could be used, then it would concentrate the Russian logistics in smaller routes, not in smaller routes, but in a smaller number of routes, which then makes it easier for those routes to be targeted and take out a larger volume of supplies. So it's better to have a wide range of different supply lines to go through in order to prevent one of them from being taken out, and that could cause extreme difficulties to the entire supply situation. So what did the Ukrainians hit? The Ukrainians, they hit two bridges, and this was yesterday, I believe. And they hit the Henichesk Strait Bridge and the Chonahar Bridge. And they hit it with French Scalp EG missiles that are fired from Su-24s, basically the French iteration of the British Storm Shadows. So let's look at the extent of the damage. Actually, I have here some images, and I'll obviously link this in the description, give credit to the person who posted this. But here you can see this is the bridge that's connecting Henichesk to the Zherebets Bridgehead. I'll actually show that bridge over here, and that's the coordinate where the bridge was struck by the Scalp missile. So you can see how the bridge, it starts out at the Zherebets Bridgehead, which is this area over here, and then it goes through the bridge and through to Henichesk. Henichesk is an important local city. It's actually the regional capital of Kherson at the moment, at least the part that's under Russian occupation. So there are some Russian civilian government facilities in this area. There's also obviously a lot of military equipment that passes through over here because it's one of the main cities that is on the border between Crimea and Kherson. And so cutting off the bridge right next to it, just to the south of it, will make it harder for communication and for cohesiveness for the Russian supplies on the rear. So let's look at the extent of the damage now. You can see that the bridge, the Henichesk bridge, as I'm going to call it, it suffered some very, very extreme damage, much more than the other bridge that we're going to talk about. So you can see the photos. You can see that the road portion of the bridge, it really did suffer some serious damage. It's going to take a very long time to repair. So we're not really thinking of a short-term framework. And this is mainly going to affect the larger military equipment, tanks, military vehicles. And that's what really matters. The civilian vehicles, that doesn't really matter. Even if those could still pass by, that's not going to change the situation on the front line and in terms of the logistics for the military. And in terms of high bearing load, that's going to be much harder to restore to full capacity for this bridge specifically. Then going to the south to the Chonahar Bridge, not really to the south, but to the southwest to the Chonahar Bridge, you can see that this bridge was also struck by the Scalp missiles. One of them actually did not detonate, and the Russians took photos of it afterwards, showing that it was undetonated, and they retrieved it. But here you can see the geolocation of where the actual Scalp missile hit the bridge, and this takes out another key resource that the Russians use, another key route to enter into Ukraine. So let's look at the extent of the damage now to see how long it could take to repair. This is the hole where the implosion occurred. And it really doesn't really show the full extent of the damage because we don't see the underside, and the underside probably suffered some even more damage, even more significant damage than can be seen from the top side view. And that's also going to cause the Russians to have to work a lot to try to repair that underside and all of its supports. And what's weird is that the governor of Kherson, Vladimir Saldo, he originally said that there were 3 holes in this bridge, but you could only really see one. And there were 2 scalp missiles that were fired at this bridge. Only one of them actually hit. The other one, as we said before, it did not detonate. But here you go. That's the extent of the damage for you guys. It's not that bad, especially in comparison to that Hanichesk bridge. So you could probably see civilian vehicles beginning to go across the bridge very soon. And then the time scale for the repair for the underside, I really have no idea. But I would say that it's probably going to be on the shorter side. In the time being, there's actually a pontoon bridge that appears to be set up. So see over here, you can see how the Russians already have pontoons in place that have not been connected yet, but you can see how that's going to be constructed in the near future. And that will be a potential new area for the Russians to move across tanks and other equipment. So that's going to be a shorter term solution. So this is not the end of the world for Russian logistics. Of course, the Russians still have other routes, but it is in the short term a big blow to their logistics around Crimea, because there's really only 4 routes out of Crimea, 4 highways. One of them was struck, the Hanichesk bridge, that one was hit. The second one is the Chonhar bridge, which was hit. So those 2 cannot be used at the moment. The other 2 are to the west, western Crimea. And those ones are supposed to be going into Kherson, into that entire region, in the western side of Kherson, not really to Zaporizhia. They can still reach Zaporizhia, but it's a much larger route, a much longer route. Just look at the course. You can see it marked in yellow. You can see how originally it's going in the direction of, Kherson, Novakakovka, Berislav, and then you have to take this sharp turn to the right and then go all the way to a place like Melitopol, and then all the way to the north to Tokmak and to the front line. So it's a much more arduous process than just going directly to that area from the northeast, as was done on the Chonhar Bridge. If you go from Jankoy to the front line using the Chonhar Bridge, that's about 220 kilometers. But if you take the route from Jankoy to the highway that goes across Armyansk towards Kherson, then you have to make this full turn over here, and it takes much longer. It takes about 400 kilometers or a bit less. So that will not only increase the volume in one specific road, which is within the Ukrainian field of artillery, because all of these different highways and this rail bridge that goes through Armyansk into the Kherson region from the western side of Crimea, that's within the field of Ukrainian artillery. And now you're going to see a lot more of this Russian equipment going through this area. So there is the possibility that some of it will be hit by the Ukrainian side with some of their batteries that are stationed in an area like over here. And let's look at the distances actually. Just in terms of distance, it's about 80 kilometers. So you're gonna have to use some of the longer range artillery. Maybe like a HIMARS could maybe reach that area, and maybe you could use some Storm Shadow missile that could be launched from this area. Or if the Ukrainians receive ATACMS, that could also be used to hit this area. So all in all, it is not the end of the world for Russian logistics, because of course they have the land bridge, and of course they have other routes through Crimea. But in the short term, it does cause some disruptions, and there's always the possibility that the Ukraine strikes it again and again, and then the situation could get worse. So Russian air defense does need to work more to prevent those storm shadows and scalps from hitting those targets. But all in all, that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.